Want to offer our sermon this morning. When we yelled Mazel Tov, I felt the heat from my face holding back my tears. The grooms dressed in tuxedo shirts were nestled in the hospice bed. Guests stood at the corner holding a large prayer shawl above them. The ceremony ended, as many Jewish ceremonies do, as they broke a glass on a hospital tray using a book, something that doesn't happen in most ceremonies. I pushed through singing the final prayer as I noticed their arms tightly gripped around one another like a seatbelt, trying to prevent the inevitable crash that would happen only weeks later. Jonathan, not yet 29, was dying from advanced stages of AIDS, barely recognizable from the man I had met at ACT UP, the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power. He had been a brilliant activist whose passion had seemed undaunted. I begged off as they served the champagne, thinking, how can they celebrate, I wondered. Already by 25, I had amassed a long list of friends claimed by that pandemic, and now I was confronted by the fact that I was officiating my first same-sex ceremony as a rabbinical student in a hospice. Things felt torn asunder, as if shattering the glass was the most truthful thing and belying the big waiting questions that were underneath the surface for me. How does one live in the face of so much brokenness? Later that evening, my roommate, a fellow AIDS activist, asked what was wrong. Laying bare my despair before him, officiating a wedding for a dying friend felt absurd. As my cynicism, my anger, and grief poured forth, he reflected, Josh, don't they deserve happiness too? What if officiating their commitment ceremony was their lifeline? Even in a hospice, I said, he's dying. How can that be helpful? Josh, everyone deserves to have joy, even in the face of tragedy. Sometimes especially in the face of tragedy. Who are you to deny them that? Remember what Harvey Milk said? You gotta give them hope. And in a similar way, I believe we have spent 9 months of this pandemic, dislocated, disoriented, and sometimes feeling broken, if we're honest. A funeral on Zoom is not so different from a wedding in a hospice. Different pandemics, different consequences, but familiar territory, despair, isolation, and questioning the utility of things sometimes. Even with a vaccine on the horizon, we have winter to contend with where we must move indoors, and we have unprecedented rising numbers, this week hitting the highest numbers that we've seen so far. So in confronting a broken reality, we can succumb to despair, or we can discover or explore and claim what are the pieces that we can still fit together. My friends, I believe this is where hope can come in. But unlike Harvey Milk, I don't think of hope as a gift that we can give to one another. Instead, I believe it is like the moment, and if you permit me, I'd like to share an example from my own faith tradition. It's like the moment during the week following the death of a loved one, where some Jews cover their mirror so that they can focus solely on grieving. So rather than a gift, hope to me is much more like removing that sheet from the mirror once the intense mourning period is over, and actively looking and seeing that there are new possibilities and that life continues. It must continue. Choosing life in the face of despair, or even death itself, is defiant hope. And I believe that kind of hope can be a spiritual practice that we can cultivate. For too long, there is the use and the understanding of hope that is passive, likely coming from its etymology that implies trust in an intervening, rescuing, and saving God, a God that most of us at our core don't fully believe in. Not that kind of God. At times, unseen forces are at work that can shift our circumstances with grace. But we should not depend on that happening, waiting for something to rescue us. When we only do that, we submissively wait for external things to change, like a vaccine or a different elected official to lead before we go about living life the best we can, or delay making necessary changes. Sometimes the most important thing is to surrender to our reality, but rarely does surrendering to our reality render us inert with no options. Instead, to have true hope is to be courageous. An act of hope, I believe, is an essential quality of resilience. Psalm 27 speaks of hope as a form of resilience. At its very close, it says, "Strengthen your heart with courage and with hope." This idea of what it means to strengthen our hearts. Tradition teaches us that a new season won't simply solve our problems. But as you move through your season of Advent, and we close this secular year, there is an invitation to cultivate the strength to address our challenges and to garner the courage to face the uncertainty of our year ahead. This makes hope an active process, not a romantic notion. We must have the humility to accept that we are rarely the entire solution, but also that daring to act as if we are a part of the redemption, and that wholeness relies on some action from us. This understanding is precisely why Rabbi Jonathan Sacks of blessed memory, who died recently, makes a distinction between optimism and hope. He taught that optimism is the belief that things are going to get better, while hope is the belief that together we can make things better. Optimism is a passive virtue. Hope is an active one. It takes very little courage to be an optimist, but it does require courage to act with hope. Hope carries a price because it demands disruption and an end to complacency. But to challenge the status quo, we must understand that hope has a relationship to our suffering. Brené Brown studied hope and started with the hypothesis that hopeful people had easier lives with more resources. How else could they be hopeful, she thought. She believed that hope emerged out of privilege. But after examining copious data on hope, she did not verify her hypothesis. Instead, she could not find a single example of moral courage or spiritual courage that was not born out of vulnerability. What she found was that people who lived hope-filled lives, wholehearted lives, understood their worthiness and concluded, like Rabbi Sacks, that hope is born from struggle and enacted with courage. People who had less guarantees in life, who were not trapped by the idea of perfectionism or the need for certainty, but rather who understood that risks were essential. They were the ones making the choices to engage hope as a practice. And so it led her to wonder if our capacity for wholeheartedness can never be greater than our willingness to be brokenhearted. Who among us has not experienced some brokenheartedness these past 9 months? Arriving at the end of a year invites us to attend to our hearts and to realign our focus to increasing the light or meaning of our lives and for that of others. Brené Brown's research also points to why engaging in this kind of repair is hopeful, as she highlights the work of social scientist C.R. Snyder. He makes the distinction between optimism and hope as well. He teaches that optimism is like a feeling, whereas hope is a thought process that consists of 3 parts that we must practice. First, he teaches that setting goals that envision the course we take is incredibly important to hope. Discerning how to achieve the goals with the possibility of adapting and charting alternative paths when needed is essential. And lastly, we cannot be hopeful if we do not take the time to believe in ourselves and our own abilities. Snyder believed, and I believe him, that hope is a mindset that is teachable and can be used as a practice. This sounds exactly like the kind of tools that a congregation such as this would work to cultivate, especially when we, as a world, are facing climate collapse, systemic racial injustice, shifts towards fascism and white supremacy. We might turn to despair or paralysis or utter hopelessness. And perhaps succumbing to despair in times like these is understandable. But I believe it is not something that we can afford, and that a congregation as talented and as powerful as this one can abide. Instead, I want to urge you to learn to practice active hope. We have reason to grieve, and we must create that space to do so. But that should not bar us from embracing hope, particularly in this season of your light. I believe we must do both. There is a 19th century commentator that was compiled by Shlomo Buber, Martin Buber's grandfather. And in a section that focused on the story of Noah's Ark, Buber recounts the line, "Then God said to Noah, 'Come out of the ark.'" And so this commentary begins to envision Noah's response, since it began to wonder, why would Noah need to be told to come out of the ark after such an ideal? Wouldn't it be a natural instinct to leave? Why would he need an invitation? The rabbis asked. Noah, they imagined, said to himself, "Well, since I entered the ark with permission from God, shall I not also leave with permission?" In other words, the conclusion is Noah is passively awaiting God's green light to leave. The Holy One, blessed be, said to Noah, "Are you looking for permission? In that case, I give you permission." As it says, "Then God said to Noah, 'Come out of the ark.'" But the rabbis continue their conversation, and they add this line. Rabbi Judah Bar Eli says, "If I had been there, I would have broken down the doors of the ark, and I would have taken myself out of it." Rabbi Judah is perplexed, even disappointed in Noah's passivity. Rabbi Judah is expressing that if it had been him, his sense of mission-driven hope would have begged for the doors of the ark to have been beaten down so that he could get to the work ahead of him, rebuilding a broken world. And he trusts that the rainbow will be on the other side. Rebecca Solnit, in her incredible book, Active Hope, is like Rabbi Judah. Her book is Hope in the Dark. She exhorts us that hope is not a lottery ticket that you can sit on the sofa and clutch, feeling lucky. She says, rather, it is an axe that you break down doors with in an emergency. Hope should shove you out the door because it will take everything you have to steer the future away from endless war, from annihilation of the earth's treasures, and the grinding down of the poor and the marginal. To hope is to give yourself to the future, and that commitment to the future is what makes the present inhabitable. So, both Rabbi Judah and Rebecca Solnit are sharing that when it comes to rebuilding a shattered world, we do not wait for permission. We do not know what the future holds, but an active hope believes that what we do matters, which is what I believe your Advent season is about. That we have an opportunity to engage a vulnerable openness to the possibility that each of us might have a role in affecting the future. And so in this Advent season, the darkness can envelop you, or it can be used for germination. We can bask in the light of others, waiting for them to rescue us, or we can take the tasks on ourselves and become the bearers of light. So when I look back at my first commitment ceremony, I believe Jonathan revealed to me that there are no limits on choosing hope until our last breath. When I think about my friends getting married, I understand now that we can practice hope and understand that the future is not yet written. I understand how my despair was not the only useful response, and that my friend's commitment ceremony could lead me to see new possibilities. I believe that despair is not a useful option at this time, in this season, or in this coming year, no matter what this year holds. And so I invite you, I ask you, won't you choose to practice hope with me in this coming year? Thank you.